In the remote stretches of rural India, where the earth feels ancient and the wind howls through the tall grasses, there stood a farm. The land was old, older than the men who worked it, older than the memories of the villagers. Its soil had seen generations of labor, the crops grown and harvested by calloused hands, the fields plowed with the sweat and blood of ancestors. But the farm held one thing no one in the area ever dared to talk about: a scarecrow. The scarecrow had stood for as long as anyone could remember, its form weathered and worn, a sentinel in the middle of a barren field. It wore a tattered coat, one that had long ago lost its original color, faded to an ashen gray. Its face, sewn together by rough hands, was stitched with crude thread, eyes that seemed to stare into your soul, and a mouth that never moved, but always appeared to be smiling in an unsettling way. Around its head, a crown of sharp thorns circled like some twisted symbol of forgotten royalty. No one knew who had built the scarecrow, or when. It had simply always been there. The farm's current owner, Raghav, was a simple man, a farmer through and through. He had inherited the farm from his father, who had inherited it from his father before him. It was all he knew. The scarecrow, despite its eerie appearance, was a part of the landscape, something Raghav didn't give much thought to. But recently, strange things had begun happening. It started small. The crows, usually terrified of the scarecrow, began gathering around it in large numbers. They would sit perched on the arms, the shoulders, and the head, cawing and flapping as if they were guarding it, not fleeing from it. Raghav noticed that his dogs would avoid the field entirely, whimpering and barking at the scarecrow from a safe distance, their tails between their legs. At night, the barn doors would creak open, the wind stirring the air, but the dogs wouldn't dare venture near the field. But the most unnerving change was that the scarecrow seemed to shift. Each morning, Raghav would wake to find the scarecrow had moved slightly, just a few inches, but enough to make his skin crawl. At first he thought it was just the wind, the coat swaying, the frame rocking in a way that gave the illusion of movement. But as the days passed, it became clearer that the scarecrow was not where it had been the day before. Each morning it was found just a little closer to the farmhouse. Raghav brushed it off as a prank. Perhaps the kids from the nearby village had decided to mess with him. He laughed it off, but deep down, a knot of unease began to tighten in his stomach. One morning he woke up to find the scarecrow at his doorstep. The scarecrow's outstretched arms were raised in the air. As if it were knocking at the door, Raghav's heart raced. He rushed to the front door, looking through the peephole. There was no one there. He opened the door slowly, his breath caught in his throat. Nothing. He stepped outside, his eyes scanning the area. The scarecrow was gone. The field was empty, but the unease lingered. Raghav couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. He decided to install security cameras around the house, hoping to catch whoever, or whatever, was responsible for the strange happenings. At first, the footage was normal. The scarecrow remained where it had always stood, in the field, unmoving. But then, something changed. At midnight, the footage began to flicker. Static filled the screens, distorting the image, making the night seem darker, thicker. And through the static, Raghav could hear something. Whispers, low and guttural, like voices, speaking in a language he couldn't understand. The whispers seemed to come from all directions, surrounding the house, echoing in the night. The dogs howled in the distance, but it was clear they were no longer howling at the moon. They were howling at the scarecrow. Raghav's heart pounded in his chest as he watched the footage. The scarecrow, standing motionless in the field, began to twitch. Slowly, impossibly, its head turned toward the house. Its stitched mouth seemed to stretch in what could only be called a smile. Raghav couldn't sleep that night. His mind raced with thoughts of what the scarecrow could be. A prank? A ghost? Something older? Something more sinister? The next day, Raghav made up his mind. He would burn it. That evening he gathered his family and took a torch to the scarecrow. The flames danced in the air as the fire consumed its tattered coat, its wooden frame cracking and popping. But as the fire burned, something strange happened. The scarecrow didn't burn. It didn't fall apart like any other man-made object would. Instead, the fire seemed to flicker around it, as if it were alive, as if it were resisting the flames. Raghav stepped back, his eyes wide with disbelief. In a final act of desperation, he threw more fuel onto the fire, watching as it roared higher. For a moment, it seemed to be working, the scarecrow starting to crumble. But when the flames died down and the smoke cleared, Raghav's heart sank. The scarecrow stood there unscathed, its face unchanged, staring at him with those unsettling eyes. It was back. The next morning, Raghav woke up to a chill in the air. The usual sounds of the farm, the clucking of chickens, the distant lowing of cows, were gone. The world seemed quieter than it ever had been. And then he saw it. The scarecrow was standing directly outside his son's bedroom window, its arms raised in a grotesque imitation of someone knocking. The face was no longer a mere stitched mask. It was smiling, as if pleased with itself, as if it had won some silent victory. Raghav's son, Arjun, was only 10 years old, innocent and unaware of the horrors that were unfolding on the farm. Raghav's heart sank as he rushed into the room, shaking his son awake. "Arjun, get up! We need to leave, now!" Arjun rubbed his eyes, groggy and confused. "What's wrong, Papa?" "There's no time. We need to go to the village, now!" Raghav grabbed his son by the arm, pulling him out of bed. But as they ran toward the door, they stopped. The house was silent, too silent. The wind had died, and the air felt thick, suffocating. When Raghav looked back toward the field, he froze. The scarecrow was no longer standing at the window. It was in the doorway. Its arms were outstretched, as if inviting them into its twisted embrace. But before Raghav could react, the door slammed shut behind him. The last thing he saw was the scarecrow's smile as it faded into the dark, its whispers following him like a shadow. Months later, after the farm was abandoned, a group of villagers came to investigate. The scarecrow stood in the field, just as it had for generations, but no one dared to approach it. The land had grown barren, the crops had stopped growing, and the animals refused to enter the area. As the group walked away, one of them turned back for a final glance. The scarecrow had moved. It was no longer in the field. It was standing at the edge of the village, and it was smiling. The village of Black Hollow sat in the shadow of the hills of ash, a forgotten place where the land was thick with secrets, and the air hung heavy with the weight of history. It was a place where time slowed down, and the world seemed to forget about the creeping darkness that lurked in the corners of forgotten places. No one dared venture too close to St. Mary's Church, and no one spoke of it without a shiver running down their spine. The church had been abandoned for over 80 years, its bell tower rusted shut, the doors sealed tight with nails, and the cemetery long overtaken by wild vines and brambles. The locals had long since stopped attending services there. In fact, it was said that the bell had not tolled in decades, and the church had been left to rot in peace, if peace could even be found in such a place. But then there was the bell. Every night, without fail, at exactly 3 a.m., the bell would toll 3 times. At first, the sound was thought to be the wind playing tricks, but as the years went on, no one dared ignore it. The bell's mournful clang echoed through the valley like the voice of some ancient, forgotten spirit, and soon the rumors spread. They said the bell was cursed, that it was the last thing anyone heard before the great fire that had ravaged the church all those years ago, claiming the lives of everyone inside. And those who had heard the bell, they said, never lived to tell the tale. The bell had become a warning, a harbinger of some terrible, unspeakable event. Whenever it rang, the village braced for something horrible. Crops withered, livestock died, children fell ill. It was as if the very fabric of the earth itself trembled in fear whenever that bell rang. Despite the fear that gripped the hearts of the villagers, there was always one man who would never turn his back on a mystery. Sebastian Rowe, a paranormal investigator known for his relentless pursuit of the truth, had heard the whispers of the cursed bell of St. Mary's Church. He had heard the stories, read the accounts, and listened to the terrified locals as they spoke of the bell's toll and the strange events that followed. But Sebastian, a man driven by the need for answers, was not afraid. He saw it as another challenge, another puzzle to solve, and so he decided to spend the night outside the church, to witness the bell's toll for himself and uncover whatever dark force haunted the ancient grounds. As night fell over Black Hollow, Sebastian drove his van down the narrow, winding road that led to St. Mary's. The village lay in silence behind him, a quiet that seemed to swallow the world whole. He could feel the weight of the darkness pressing in on him, the oppressive silence making every breath feel heavier than the last. The tall, gnarled trees that surrounded the church seemed to lean in, as if watching him, waiting for him to make a mistake. It was as if the church itself was alive, its ancient stone walls and shattered windows glaring down at him in disdain. Sebastian parked his van at the edge of the overgrown cemetery, the ground beneath his feet wet and soft from the recent rain. He grabbed his equipment, a flashlight, a recorder, and his most trusted camera, and made his way toward the church. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. It felt unnatural, wrong. As he stood before the church, he could almost hear the whispers of the past, the voices of those who had once filled these walls with their prayers. But now, the only sound was the wind, rustling through the broken windows like a mournful sigh. He took a deep breath and set up his equipment outside the church, positioning himself near the large oak tree that grew just a few feet from the rusted gates. It was 2:45 a.m. The village was asleep, and he was alone with his thoughts. The feeling of being watched never left him. Something in the air was wrong in a way he couldn't quite explain. At exactly 2:59 a.m., everything went still. The world around him seemed to freeze, as if the very air itself had stopped moving. The wind ceased its rustling. The trees ceased their swaying. Even the insects, normally buzzing around in the summer night, fell silent. The moon above was a sickly shade of green, casting long, twisted shadows across the ground. The temperature dropped, and a chill ran through Sebastian's spine. The kind of chill that felt as though it were crawling beneath his skin, reaching into his bones. He checked his watch. It was 2:59 a.m. exactly. Sebastian's heart began to race. He had read about this phenomenon, how the air would grow heavy and oppressive just before the bell tolled. But no amount of preparation could have prepared him for the dread that washed over him in that moment. It was as if the very earth itself was holding its breath, waiting for something terrible to happen. And then it came. The bell tolled. At first it was just a faint sound, barely audible over the eerie silence that clung to the night. But as the bell rang again, the sound grew louder, deeper, and more resonant. The tolling of the bell was not the familiar clang of metal against metal, but a horrifying, guttural sound, as though the bell itself were alive, writhing in agony. The bell tolled once, then twice, and then, for the third time, It rang out with a deafening scream, a sound that sent a jolt of terror through Sebastian's entire body. It wasn't the toll of a bell anymore. It was something else, something far worse. The scream was raw, primal, a sound that could only come from something ancient and evil. It seemed to echo through the very fabric of reality, shaking the ground beneath Sebastian's feet. The air became thick with a suffocating presence, as if the earth itself was alive and breathing, its pulse quickening. Then came the noise, soft at first, like the faint rustling of earth being disturbed. But as the minutes dragged on, the sound grew louder, more insistent. It was as if something was emerging from the ground beneath the church, something long buried, something that had been waiting for centuries. Sebastian's pulse quickened, his hands trembling as he fumbled with his camera. He couldn't tear his eyes away from the ground beneath the church, where the earth seemed to shift and writhe as if it were alive. The shadows around him stretched unnaturally long, and a faint, flickering light seemed to pulse from within the church itself. And then, out of the darkness, a figure began to emerge from the earth. It was cloaked in shadow, its shape indistinct, but its presence was undeniable. The ground cracked and split as the figure pulled itself free from the dirt, its form slowly rising from the earth, like a corpse rising from the grave. Sebastian's breath caught in his throat as he saw it. The thing that had been buried beneath the church all those years ago. It was a man, or at least it had once been a man. His face was twisted and contorted, skin stretched tight over bone, eyes hollow and black like pits of despair. His body was skeletal, covered in rags that had once been a robe, now torn and decayed. But what terrified Sebastian the most was the name it whispered, a name he knew all too well. Sebastian. The figure's voice was not a whisper, but a guttural rasp, a sound that seemed to reverberate in his very soul. It knew his name. It knew everything about him. And as the figure took another step forward, the ground trembled beneath his feet, and the bell tolled once more, 3 times. But this time, there was no warning, only the scream of the bell and the silence that followed. The figure was almost upon him now, and Sebastian knew, in that moment, that the bell wasn't just a warning. It was a summons for him. It had been a dream for Sarah and Ethan. The escape from the city, the escape from the noise and the constant bustle. They'd found an old farmhouse on the outskirts of a quiet town, nestled between golden fields and a thick forest, far enough from civilization to give them the peace they craved. It was the kind of place that promised serenity, if only the house would allow it. The couple had bought the property with grand plan, renovated into a charming weekend retreat, a getaway to leave behind the chaos of everyday life. The farmhouse, with its weathered exterior and overgrown garden, was perfect. It had character, history, a long-forgotten corner of the world waiting to be rediscovered. For the first few days, everything went smoothly. They spent their time scrubbing floors, sanding wooden beams, and laughing as they imagined what the house would look like once finished. They explored the rooms, discussed furniture, and picked out paint colors. The attic, hidden behind an old wooden door at the end of the hall, remained locked, part of the house they hadn't gotten to yet. Then came the knocking. It was faint at first, so soft they thought it was the house settling, the wind creaking the beams. But night after night, it grew more distinct, a slow, deliberate rhythm that echoed from above their heads. The sound was unsettling, almost like a gentle tap-tap-tap, followed by a pause, then tap-tap-tap again. The knocking never stopped. It seemed to come from the attic, though they couldn't be sure. Sarah had always been the more sensitive one of the two. Ethan would joke about the house being old and creaky, attributing the noises to its age, but Sarah's nerves began to fray. She couldn't sleep, tossing and turning every night, unable to shake the feeling that something or someone was up there. One evening, after weeks of sleepless nights, Sarah insisted they open the attic door. Ethan, exhausted from the relentless noise, agreed. They gathered their courage, and with the creak of old hinges, the door swung open. The attic was dark and musty, filled with dust and forgotten relics. Cobwebs hung from the rafters, and an ancient trunk sat in one corner. But it was the wall that caught Sarah's attention. It was covered in something strange, writing. At first, they couldn't make sense of it. The words were scrawled in a hurried, almost frantic hand. But as they stepped closer, Sarah's breath caught in her throat. The name was written over and over again, as if the person who had written it had lost their mind in the process. Sarah, 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 her name. Ethan turned to her, his face pale. This is strange. I don't understand. How is this possible? Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. The thought that someone long before them had been trapped in this place, repeating her name over and over, filled her with dread. They searched the attic further, but all they found were remnants of the past, old newspapers, forgotten furniture, and the name scrawled again and again. But that was all. No answers, only question. That night, the knocking resumed. Only this time, it was louder, more persistent, as if something was trying to get out. Sarah could feel it. There was something in the house with them, something that didn't want to be found. Over the next few days, strange things began happening. The attic door started opening by itself. At first, Sarah chalked it up to the old hinges, or perhaps the wind. But the door would open slowly, inch by inch, in the dead of night, when the house was supposed to be still. Ethan, though skeptical, began to notice it too. But it was the bruises that started appearing on Sarah's arms that truly unnerved them. At first they were small, just faint marks, easily brushed off as scratches from old furniture. But they grew darker, more pronounced. The bruises began to take on the shape of fingers, as though someone had grabbed her in the night. "Ethan," she whispered one morning, her voice barely audible. "I'm scared. Something's in this house. It's not just the house creaking. I feel like I'm being watched." Ethan held her close, trying to calm her. But inside, he too felt it. The house wasn't right. Then one evening, as they sat down to dinner, they both heard it. A soft, wailing cry. It came from above, clear, mournful. Sarah froze, her fork suspended in midair. Ethan's face drained of color as he glanced up at the ceiling, where the noise seemed to be coming from. "Is someone in the attic?" he asked, his voice strained. I don't know," Sarah whispered, her eyes wide with fear. She had heard the cry before, but she'd convinced herself it was just her imagination. Now, it was undeniable. The next morning, Ethan woke to an eerie silence. He looked over at Sarah, who was already sitting up in bed, staring at the door to the attic. She hadn't moved all night. "Sarah?" Ethan called softly, but she didn't respond. He stood and walked toward her, concern growing in his chest. As he neared the door, he felt a cold chill in the air. It was as if something was pressing against him, making it hard to breathe. Suddenly, Sarah turned her head to face him, her eyes wide and unblinking, but it wasn't her voice that spoke. "Sarah, Sarah," the voice echoed, a whisper that chilled Ethan to the bone. It wasn't his wife's voice, it was something darker, older, something that didn't belong. "Sarah, Sarah, Sarah." It repeated the name, its rhythm slow and deliberate, just like the knocking. Ethan's heart raced as he backed away, but Sarah didn't move. She just stood there, staring at the door, her mouth moving in silent repetition of the name on the wall in the attic. As if guided by an invisible force, Sarah began walking toward the attic. She moved slowly, almost like a sleepwalker, her bare feet padding against the cold wooden floor. Ethan tried to stop her, but she brushed past him, her movements stiff and unnatural. "No, Sarah, don't," he pleaded, but she didn't hear him. Her eyes were locked on the attic door. Before he could stop her, she had entered the attic. Ethan hesitated only for a moment before following, his pulse pounding in his ears. There, in the darkness, he found her, standing in the center of the room, her back to him. She was still repeating the name. "Sarah!" Ethan shouted, his voice breaking. But she didn't respond. And then from the corner of the room, something stirred, a shadow. It was subtle at first, a mere shifting in the darkness, but then it moved closer, slowly, deliberately. Something was there, something watching them. Ethan's heart slammed in his chest as he stepped forward, his hand reaching for Sarah's arm. But before he could touch her, the shadow lunged. It was like a cold hand clamping down on his chest, a pressure so intense he couldn't breathe. He gasped for air as the world around him seemed to distort, the room stretching and warping, and then he heard it, the sound of the knocking, louder than ever before, filling the room, pounding in his skull. The walls seemed to close in, the floor beneath him shifting, and the name, her name, it echoed through the attic, vibrating through the air until it was all consuming. Sarah, Sarah. And just like that, everything went dark. The rain had come in waves throughout the day, heavy and unpredictable, but by evening it had stopped, leaving the world damp and still. The last remnants of twilight lingered in the sky, fading into the kind of darkness that feels like something's waiting to swallow you whole. In the sleepy stretch of land between two small villages, a narrow dirt road snaked its way through the dense trees, leading travelers from one settlement to the other. Most people avoided it after dark. They said there was something about that road, something that made even the bravest of them shiver at the thought of walking it after sundown. But Jake Marshall wasn't like the others. A new delivery driver, Jake had been working in the area for just over a week. He wasn't used to the superstitions of small towns, and the talk about the dirt road was just that, talk. Stories passed down through generations, nothing more than local folklore. At least, that's what he told himself. He had heard the whispers from his co-workers, tales of a shadow that walked the road every night, a black figure that was more of a presence than a being. No face, no legs, just a silhouette floating above the ground. People said it never chased, never spoke. It just followed. He scoffed at it. Old people's tales. He wasn't one to buy into that nonsense. It was on his way home, after a long shift, that he made his decision. His bike had been giving him trouble all day. Slow starts, sputtering gears, but he figured it would hold out for just one more trip. Taking the longer route around would add another 30 minutes to his journey. But the shortcut along the dirt road would shave time off. He could be back at his small apartment in no time, maybe even catch the tail end of the game. Jake shrugged off the strange feeling in his chest as he turned onto the dirt road, the wheels of his bike crunching on the loose gravel. The air was thick with the scent of wet earth and trees, the sky an inky expanse that seemed to close in around him. The road itself was narrow, overgrown on either side, but it wasn't impassable. His headlights cast long shadows ahead of him, the bike's engine humming steadily beneath him as he pedaled forward. He should have listened to the stories. The first sign of trouble came when the lights on his bike flickered. At first, it was barely noticeable, a brief dip in the brightness, but then it happened again, longer this time. The headlights sputtered out entirely, plunging him into total darkness. His heart skipped a beat, but he wasn't about to panic. He tried the switch again, flicking the light on and off, but nothing happened. The bike stalled. "Damn it," Jake muttered, his breath coming in short, frustrated bursts. He set his feet down, hearing the faint crunch of gravel underfoot as he dismounted. His phone screen glowed dimly in the dark, and he checked the time, 9:38 p.m. No way he was going to sit here in the middle of nowhere waiting for his bike to kick back on. He reached into his bag for the flashlight, squinting as he tried to locate it in the pitch black. That's when he heard it, a faint rustling from somewhere ahead, beyond the trees. The sound was soft at first, just a whisper in the wind, but it grew louder, like footsteps, heavy, dragging footsteps. His stomach turned. He wasn't sure why, but he felt an instinctive chill run through him, a warning crawling up his spine. He shined the flashlight down the road. Nothing. Jake let out a shaky laugh. Just an animal, he told himself. Maybe a deer. But the rustling continued. The steps, now deliberate, almost too slow, dragging. He strained his ears, hearing something that almost sounded like breathing. A sharp intake of air. Then from the corner of his eye, a movement. He snapped his head to the side. At first he thought it was a trick of the shadows, a tree branch swaying in the wind, perhaps. But as his eyes adjusted to the darkness, he saw it, a figure in the distance, standing motionless at the edge of the road. Tall, too tall. Its shape was so black, it absorbed the light around it, leaving nothing but a silhouette of impossible darkness. Jake froze. It wasn't like any person he had ever seen. No face, no distinguishing features. Just a figure. Its form seemed to ripple in the darkness, as though it wasn't quite bound to the physical world. His pulse quickened. The hairs on his neck stood on end. And for the first time since he'd arrived in town, Jake felt the unease that everyone had warned him about. The stories, the shadow. He laughed nervously, trying to convince himself it was just his imagination, some trick of the dark. But then he blinked, and in the time it took for his eyelids to flutter shut and open again, the figure had moved. It was closer, 10 feet closer, just enough that the dread in his chest twisted into something darker, something cold. His breath caught in his throat. A voice, soft and insistent, echoed in his mind. "It's following you." Panic surged through him like a tidal wave. He didn't hesitate. Grabbing the bike, he swung his leg over it and kicked the pedal with all his might. The engine sputtered and coughed to life, and he surged forward into the night. Behind him, the shadows seemed to stretch, pulling at him, as though the very darkness was chasing him. But when he glanced back, there was nothing. The road was empty. His heart still pounded in his chest. But Jake allowed himself a breath of relief. Maybe it was nothing after all, just his imagination running wild. He pushed on, faster now, eager to leave the road behind. But as he reached the end of the dirt path and approached the first house on the outskirts of town, something strange happened. The road wasn't ending. It kept going, stretching out before him, the same dark stretch of dirt, the same trees lining the sides, as if it had looped back on itself. The shadow was still there. No, not there. It was closer, closer than before. Jake's hands gripped the handlebars as fear gripped him tight. He could feel the presence now, something close behind, something that wasn't quite human, and it was following him, always just a few steps behind. His breath came faster, his legs pumping harder. The lights flickered again, then died completely, plunging him into darkness. His bike sputtered to a stop. The shadow was there, right in front of him. No footsteps, no breath, just the oppressive weight of darkness pressing in on him from every side. Jake scrambled off the bike, his body shaking with fear, his mind scrambling for an explanation, anything. But the shadow had no shape, no form. It was only there to follow. It didn't chase, didn't make a sound. It was just there, closing in. The world around him seemed to stop. The air grew thick, suffocating, and Jake felt his heart thudding in his chest like a drumbeat of doom. He wasn't sure how long he stood there, frozen, but then he heard it. Footsteps, not behind him, in his house, the ones that followed him all the way home. The sound of footsteps grew louder, coming closer. He stood there, unable to move, unable to breathe, his thoughts a jumbled mess. His body screamed for him to run, to get away, but his feet were glued to the spot. The shadow, it seemed, had never left. And worst of all, his shadow, the one he saw in the reflection of the hallway mirror, did not move. It stood frozen, motionless, while he was shaking in terror. Then it moved, and Jake knew, in that moment, that it would never leave. In the backwoods of North Carolina, where the land met the sky in an endless stretch of tangled trees and dense underbrush, there was a creek that locals avoided like the plague. Hollow Creek, it was called, a name whispered with reverence and dread. Old-timers and storytellers spoke of its waters in hushed tones, sharing tales of a creature said to haunt the area. A half-man, half-goat, monstrosity with jagged horns and glowing yellow eyes. But what truly made the creature terrifying wasn't its grotesque appearance or its sinister presence. It was its voice. The goat man was said to be able to mimic anyone's voice, family, friends, even the voice of a loved one who had passed. And that voice, it would call to you from deep within the woods, sweet and familiar, pulling you closer to the creek's banks, where the shadows were deep and the air thick with the stench of decay. The village near Hollow Creek had long been abandoned, its cottages now rotting under the weight of time. The few who still lived nearby kept their distance, never daring to venture close to the water's edge. There was no use in tempting fate, they said, no reason to anger the goat man. But then came the explorers, a group of 5 urban adventurers, led by a man named David, who were always on the lookout for forgotten places, abandoned structures, and the hidden secrets of the world. They had explored old asylums, deserted amusement parks, and crumbling buildings, but they had heard of Hollow Creek and the Goatman only in passing, just another legend. So when they saw it mentioned in a forum online, they didn't hesitate. The Goatman? That was just a myth, a story told to scare children. David, the most skeptical of the group, laughed as he packed his bag. This is going to be nothing more than another creepy campfire story. We'll film some footage, get some creepy shots, and be back in time for dinner. The others, Jordan, Elisa, Max, and Lila, nodded in agreement. They'd been on plenty of similar trips, and none of them believed in the supernatural. If anything, the thrill of exploring the unknown was the real allure. The 5 of them set out in the early morning, the cool air nipping at their faces as they made their way into the forest. The trees grew thicker and darker as they ventured deeper, the sunlight barely breaking through the canopy. The further they went, the more oppressive the silence became. No birds, no insects, just the occasional rustle of leaves beneath their boots. David led the way, camera in hand, filming every step they took. Hollow Creek, he said, giving the camera a grin. Where legends are born, apparently. They walked for hours, laughing and joking until they reached the creek. It was exactly as the stories had described, its waters dark and murky, the banks lined with twisted trees whose gnarled roots seemed to claw at the earth. The air was thick with the smell of damp wood and something else, something foul. Max, the most adventurous of the group, was the first to step forward, grinning wide. "So where's this Goatman, huh? Anyone see any horns or glowing eyes?" The others chuckled, but even they couldn't deny the strange feeling in the air. The place felt wrong, like it was watching them, waiting. They set up camp by the creek, cracking open cans of beer and setting up their cameras. As the sun dipped behind the trees, the shadows deepened. They were about to call it a day when they heard it, a voice. David froze, his beer halfway to his mouth. "Did you hear that?" The others looked at him, confused. "Hear what?" Jordan asked. David's eyes were wide. "I swear, I heard someone calling my name." A chill ran down their spines. It was impossible. They were miles from the nearest house, and no one had been in these woods for years. The voice had come from the trees, faint but unmistakable. Then they heard it again. "David." It was low and slow, like a whisper carried on the wind, but it was undeniably his brother's voice. David's blood ran cold. His brother had died in a car accident 2 years ago, and the pain of his loss had never quite left him. It was the reason David had started exploring, trying to escape the constant ache of grief. Now to hear his voice, clear as day, in the middle of nowhere. He stood up, his hand shaking as he wiped sweat from his brow. It's my brother," he whispered, barely believing it. "I have to go. He's calling me." "David." "No," Lila said, her voice trembling. "It's not him. It's some kind of trick." But David's eyes were fixed on the trees, and before anyone could stop him, he stepped toward the woods. "It's him. I know it's him." His footsteps were slow at first, almost hesitant, but the call of his brother grew louder, more urgent, pulling him deeper into the woods. "David!" Max shouted. "Don't go! It's a trap!" But David didn't stop. The others followed, though they were too terrified to speak. They had to stop him, but they couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Deeply wrong. They reached the edge of the woods, the trees thick and oppressive. David was still walking, his steps quickening with every word he heard. "David, come closer." The others tried to grab him, but it was too late. David was gone, swallowed up by the darkness between the trees. The sound of his footsteps faded away, replaced by silence. "David!" Elisa screamed, but there was no answer. They waited for what felt like an eternity, hearts racing, until a figure finally emerged from the woods. It was David. At least it looked like him, but something was off. His posture was stiff, his movements too deliberate. His eyes, those weren't the eyes of their friend. David's mouth opened, but it wasn't his voice that came out. "Come closer," it whispered, the voice twisted and alien. "Come closer, my friends." The others recoiled in horror. The creature before them had David's face, but the eyes, those yellow, glowing eyes, belonged to something far older, far darker. And then they realized the truth. The goat man didn't kill you. It didn't rip you apart or feast on your flesh. No, it did something far worse. It took your place. It wore your skin, and it left behind nothing but a hollow shell. David's body, no, not David anymore, took a step forward, and with a voice that now echoed with something inhuman, it beckoned them closer. "Join me in the forest. There's no escape." The others ran, their hearts pounding in their chests. But they weren't fast enough. Elisa felt something brush against her arm, cold, wet, and sticky. She turned to find a hand reaching out from the shadows, and her scream echoed through the trees. The goat man was here, and they had all heard his call. As the others ran, they realized with horror that it wasn't just David who had been replaced. It was everyone who heard the voice, everyone who followed it into the woods. They had crossed into the realm of Hollow Creek, where the goatman's whispers would never stop, and those who answered him would never return.